The morning was heavy with fog, wrapping the quiet suburban street in a blanket of stillness. It was the kind of day where even the chirping of birds seemed muffled, as if the world itself had decided to sleep in. I had just finished unpacking the last of the kitchen boxes when the faint chime of my doorbell echoed through the house. Standing on my doorstep was a man in his late 60s, impeccably dressed despite the casual neighborhood. His crisp button-down shirt was tucked neatly into khakis, and his face was framed by a trim, silvery beard. His eyes were sharp yet warm, the kind that compelled you to trust him immediately. "Good morning," he said, his voice smooth and steady. "I'm Henry Wilder, your neighbor from across the street. Thought I'd welcome you to the neighborhood properly." In his hands he held a small tray, atop which sat 2 porcelain cups and a steaming pot of coffee. "Hope you don't mind." I hesitated. I wasn't used to such gestures, but his presence was disarming in a way I couldn't explain. I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. The moment he crossed the threshold, the air seemed to shift, barely noticeable, like a draft sneaking through a crack in the window. I dismissed it as nerves and motioned toward the dining table. "This is a lovely place," he remarked, setting the tray down. "Old houses like these have so much character." He poured the coffee with a precision that bordered on reverence. The rich, nutty aroma filled the air, and I couldn't help but breathe deeply, letting it settle me. "I hope you like black," he said, handing me a cup. "It's the only way to taste it properly." I took a tentative sip. It was the best coffee I'd ever tasted, velvety and complex, with an earthy undertone I couldn't place. For a moment, it seemed to warm more than my body. Memories I couldn't quite pin down floated just out of reach, like forgotten melodies. "I've lived here for 30 years, Mr. Wilder said, breaking the silence. "Seen families come and go, each leaving a little piece of themselves behind. Houses like this, they remember things." Something about his words prickled at the edge of my mind, but before I could ask what he meant, he smiled. "I should let you get back to unpacking. Thank you for indulging an old man's whims." As he left, I noticed something odd. The cup he'd used was spotless. No residue, no stain, as if he'd never touched it. I told myself I was imagining things. Still, when I sat down to finish my coffee, it no longer tasted quite the same. The next day, Mr. Wilder invited me over. I wasn't sure why I agreed. Maybe it was his warmth, or maybe it was the lingering curiosity about his strange words. Either way, I found myself walking up his garden path as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in muted orange. His house was immaculate, a stark contrast to my own chaotic mess of unpacked boxes. Every piece of furniture seemed hand-picked, polished to a shine that bordered on obsessive. A faint, woody smell hung in the air. Cedar, maybe, or something older. We sat at a small round table in his sunroom, the windows framing the dimming sky like a painting. He had prepared another pot of coffee, the aroma familiar, but with a sharper, almost tangy note this time. "I thought we could make this a tradition," he said, pouring 2 cups. "You seem like someone who appreciates the little rituals." I smiled politely, unsure of what to say. As I took a sip, that strange warmth washed over me again, along with something else, a flicker of recognition. "I hope you don't mind me saying," he began, his tone casual, "but you remind me of someone I used to know. A tenant who lived in your house, must have been 20 years ago. Sweet girl, loved her coffee." There it was again. His words, innocuous on the surface, carried an unsettling weight. "What happened to her?" I asked. "Oh, she moved on," he said lightly, but his eyes betrayed something deeper, a shadow of loss or regret. "Life has a way of scattering us, doesn't it?" He began sharing stories, small vignettes of his life that felt oddly specific, yet familiar. He described a trip to Europe he'd taken decades ago, the way the cobblestone streets felt underfoot, the sound of a violin drifting through an open window. As he spoke, I saw it, not imagined, but remembered. My stomach churned. How could I recall something I'd never experienced? "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice cutting through my disorientation. I forced a laugh. "Just tired, I guess. Moving is exhausting." He nodded knowingly, his expression sympathetic. "Well, you mustn't overdo it. Take it slow. The house will wait for you. It's not going anywhere." When I left, the air outside was cold and biting, yet the sensation in my chest lingered, something between nostalgia and dread. That night, my dreams were vivid and nonsensical. I wandered through unfamiliar streets, following the faint smell of coffee, only to wake with the taste of ash on my tongue. The next morning, I found a note tucked under my door. "Coffee tomorrow? Same time?" It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. The following morning, I returned to Mr. Wilder's house. The sky was overcast, the gray light lending an eerie pallor to the world. As I stepped inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was watching me, its walls whispering secrets too quiet to hear. Mr. Wilder greeted me with his usual warmth, ushering me into the sunroom where a fresh pot of coffee awaited. The aroma was different this time, sharper and more intense, carrying a faint, earthy bitterness that reminded me of damp soil. "I tried something special today," he said, pouring a steaming cup. "A roast I haven't brewed in years. It has a way of unlocking memories." The words struck me oddly, but I smiled and accepted the cup. The first sip was electric, a complex interplay of flavors that danced on my tongue and sank deep into my senses. But with the taste came something else, a vision, fleeting but vivid. I was standing in a sunlit garden, my hands caked with soil, the smell of freshly turned earth mingling with the fragrance of flowers. A figure stood nearby, their face hidden by the glare of the sun. I blinked, and the scene dissolved as quickly as it had appeared. "Are you all right?" Mr. Wilder's voice pulled me back to the present. I think so," I stammered. "That coffee is potent." He smiled, his expression inscrutable. "It has a way of stirring the mind. Tell me, did it bring anything back?" The question startled me. "What do you mean?" He leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window. "Coffee, like memory, is layered. The right cup can unlock doors you didn't even know existed." I didn't know how to respond, so I focused on the coffee. With each sip, the strange vision grew clearer, the fragments coalescing into something almost tangible. I could feel the weight of a trowel in my hand, hear the distant hum of bees. And then there was a voice, familiar yet elusive. "Dig deeper," it whispered, soft but insistent. I set the cup down, my hands trembling. "What is this?" Mr. Wilder's expression darkened slightly. "You're beginning to see. That house of yours has seen its share of lives, each one leaving an imprint. Sometimes those echoes reach out, especially to someone sensitive." "Sensitive to what?" My voice cracked as I spoke. He shrugged, his gaze piercing. "To the past, to what lingers." When I left his house, the air outside felt heavier, as though the fog had seeped into my very being. That night I dreamed of the garden again, but this time the vision lingered longer. The figure in the sun resolved into a woman, her back turned to me as she dug into the soil. She paused, wiping her brow, and began to hum a tune I couldn't place. When she turned to face me, I woke in a cold sweat. The next time I visited Mr. Wilder, I was determined to get answers. The visions were becoming more vivid, more intrusive, and I needed to know what was happening. The note he'd left under my door, same time, felt less like an invitation and more like a summons. He greeted me with his usual charm, but I noticed a shift in his demeanor. There was an edge to his movements, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Today's brew is even more special," he said, pouring the coffee. "I've been saving it for a moment like this." I hesitated before taking the cup. "What do you mean?" He chuckled softly. "You'll see." The first sip was overwhelming. The taste was darker, richer, almost suffocating in its intensity. As the liquid spread across my tongue, the now familiar sensation swept over me, a pull, as though my consciousness were being yanked through a narrow corridor. The vision came faster this time. I was back in the garden, but now the woman was kneeling beside a rosebush, her fingers brushing the petals with reverence. The hum of bees grew louder, and the sunlight seemed unnaturally bright. I felt an urge to speak to her, to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. "Do you see her?" Mr. Wilder's voice pierced through the vision, pulling me back to reality. The room spun as I blinked, trying to steady myself. "What's happening to me?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He leaned forward, his expression calm but intense. "Your house carries memories, layers of them. You're seeing the life of someone who lived there before you, a life that refuses to be forgotten." I wanted to argue, to deny it, but the truth was undeniable. "Why is this happening now?" He smiled faintly. "Perhaps the house chose you, or perhaps you've always been connected." As he spoke, I noticed something odd about the table where my cup rested. The surface was marred by a strange mark, a circular burn, its edges jagged like a scorched sigil. Without thinking, I reached out to trace it, but Mr. Wilder's hand shot out, stopping me. "Careful," he said, his tone sharp. "Some marks are better left untouched." "Is this part of it?" I asked, gesturing to the burn. His gaze held mine for a long moment before he nodded. "It's a reminder, a tether, if you will." "To what?" He didn't answer, but his silence spoke volumes. That night, as I lay in bed, the dreams returned. This time, the garden was gone, replaced by a room bathed in flickering candlelight. The woman was there, seated at a table identical to Mr. Wilder's. She held a cup of coffee, her eyes fixed on the sigil burned into the wood. The voice returned, whispering softly, "It's not just coffee. It's a door." The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee. At first, it seemed unremarkable, just a phantom scent lingering from the previous day. But as I opened my eyes, I realized it wasn't coming from my kitchen. It was stronger, richer, and oddly familiar. Mr. Wilder's signature blend, the one that had come to haunt my thoughts and dreams. I padded to the living room, my skin prickling as I realized the air felt thicker, as if it had weight. The scent grew stronger the closer I got to the dining table. There, sitting in the exact center, was a cup of coffee. Steam rose from its surface in delicate, spiraling tendrils. I hadn't brewed it. I hadn't even stepped into the kitchen yet. I should have thrown it out, dumped it in the sink, and scrubbed every inch of my house until the scent was gone. Instead, I sat down, the pull of the cup stronger than reason. My reflection shimmered in the dark liquid, distorted and strange. It looked like me, but it wasn't. It smiled when I wasn't smiling, its eyes glittering with something cold and ancient. The first sip was unavoidable. My hand moved of its own accord, the cup lifting to my lips like it had been waiting for this moment. The taste hit me like a flood, too strong, too bitter, drowning me in sensations I couldn't understand. The room fell away, replaced by a darkness so deep it felt alive. In the void, the visions came, not flashes, but a torrent. I was back in the candle-lit room, the woman at the table. Her face was clearer now, lined with exhaustion, but beautiful in its melancholy. She wasn't humming this time. Instead, she stared into her coffee, her fingers tracing the edge of the cup. I tried to speak, to ask her who she was, but the words caught in my throat. She looked up suddenly, her eyes meeting mine. "You've come far enough," she said, her voice soft yet commanding. "But you don't belong here." The room around her began to shift, the walls dissolving into shadows that writhed and pulsed like living things. The table splintered, the coffee spilling across the surface, forming shapes that twisted into words I couldn't read but somehow understood. "Go back," the woman said, "before it's too late." I gasped and jolted back into my own dining room, the taste of coffee still heavy on my tongue. The cup was gone, replaced by a single slip of paper. Its edges were singed, the faint scent of smoke curling from it. Scrawled in an unsteady hand were 3 words. "It's not yours." I stumbled back, the room spinning. My chest felt tight, the weight of the visions pressing against my ribs. I needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them. Mr. Wilder's door was ajar when I arrived. I stepped inside hesitantly, calling his name. The house was quiet, the sunroom filled with the warm glow of morning light. The table was set as it always was: 2 cups, a fresh pot of coffee, and a delicate tray of sugar cubes. But Mr. Wilder was nowhere to be seen. I walked further in, my footsteps muffled by the thick rug beneath me. The air was stifling, heavy with the same aroma that had haunted my senses. As I approached the table, I noticed something new. A small box resting beside the coffee pot, its surface intricately carved with looping organic patterns that seemed to shift under my gaze. I reached for it, my fingers brushing the cool wood. The moment I touched it, the room seemed to tilt, the light warping into a hazy, golden glow. A voice, not Mr. Wilder's but familiar, echoed in my ears. "You can't take it back." The box clicked open on its own, revealing a collection of small, polished stones, each etched with a faint sigil. They shimmered in the light, drawing my gaze until the room seemed to collapse around them. Images flickered in my mind. Faces, lives, moments, all tied to the coffee, to the table, to Mr. Wilder himself. I pulled my hand away, the box snapping shut as if it had a will of its own. Behind me, the sound of footsteps broke the silence. "I warned you," Mr. Wilder said softly, his voice heavy with something I couldn't place. Regret, perhaps, or resignation. "Some things are meant to stay forgotten." I turned to face him, my heart racing. "What is this? What are you?" He smiled faintly, the lines of his face deepening. "A caretaker of sorts. I hold the memories others can't, so they can live free of their burdens. But once the cup is shared, there's no going back." The weight of his words sank in, the truth pressing against my mind like a storm cloud. I looked at the table, at the box, at the steaming pot of coffee that seemed to beckon me still. "I don't want this," I whispered. "Then leave," he said simply, "and don't come back." I fled without another word, the house and its secrets fading behind me. But even now, in the quiet of my own home, I can still taste the coffee on my tongue. It lingers like a shadow, like a memory that refuses to fade.